Good morning and welcome to Chancellor's opening session. This is one time in the year that we come together to talk about important initiatives and the overall condition of the district. And I'd like to begin by calling forward our student trustee, Lamar Lamond, to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. And Lamar will be followed by our Vice President of the Board, Tim Jamal.
Morning, everyone. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So as Chancellor, thank you for hosting the opening session. Pleasure to be here. It's my first time, I think, addressing Chancellor's opening session. I am Vice President of the Board of Trustees. I'm here because our Board President, TJ Prendergast, is in a good place right now with his family, enjoying family time, and we wish him well. Let me take a moment here to introduce my colleagues who are here with us today. Several other trustees on the board. Trustee Marcia Milchiker. Trustee Bobby J. And Trustee Jim Wright. Well, I was really pleased to see so many engaging sessions that are occurring this week, and I wish I could attend more of them, be here today and try to attend a few of the others, but we're really fortunate to work and be involved in a district like this. It's an amazing place. There are a lot of challenges, of course, and I think challenges we're trying to address. I recently traveled I did some biking around Lake Tahoe area last week, and I wore my Saddleback and IBC apparel, and it seemed like every stop I went, someone was aware of either Saddleback College or Irvine Valley College. So it makes me feel good to be part of this district, and you should know that we're very well regarded. So I think it's really fantastic to be part of this district. The board, as you know, sets policy. We don't get involved in day-to-day management of the district, but we're always interested to hear from various constituent groups and stakeholder groups. Over the past year, the board heard presentations on a number of issues that are really important to our district and community college statewide and nationwide. We heard about student equity plans, enrollment management plans and challenges, the 50% law, full-time faculty obligation number, classified staff, the academic calendar. Please work that out. It means less time we have to spend at our board meetings. I hope we can work that out this year. CTE programs and student success scorecard, which is, of course, one measurement of our success. The one thing, I was coming in this morning listening to the news, and the issue of student debt came up again, and I think now student debt nationwide is over $1.2 trillion, which is troubling. We are part of a community college district, which probably is the best buy in education. I think we're doing our part, but I think there's even more we can do in terms of outreach to the community here to let them know that the community colleges are a viable option. And we can't resolve the $1.2 trillion student debt issue, but we can do our part here in South Orange County. I thank you for being here. Look forward to a great opening session, and I'll turn it back over to Chancellor Portner. Thank you.
Before I get started, I'd like to introduce a very special guest. We have a visitor today, our keynote speaker, Mr. Paul Grossman. It's an honor to have Paul with us here today, and we want to thank him for traveling from Northern California and the Bay Area down here to be with us today. I'd also like to introduce my executive team members. Saddleback College President Todd Burnett. Irvine Valley College President Glenn Rockmore. Vice Chancellor of Business Services Deborah Fitzsimmons. Vice Chancellor of Technology and Learning Services Bob Ramucci. It's a new academic year, and we have many new full-time faculty members in our midst. And I'd like to ask Presidents Todd Burnett and Glenn Rockmore to come forward and introduce their new full-time faculty.
Thank you, Chancellor Portner. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the new academic year. I'd also like to welcome all of our guests and obviously our wonderful partners at Irvine Valley College, District Service, and other guests at Saddleback College. With that, we're very thrilled. We have 16 new faculty, full-time faculty members that we are welcoming today. And when I call your name, if you could just stand. First is Jacqueline Bloink, and she's a professor of health information technology. Hollis Casey is one of our counselors. Another counselor, Cheryl Christensen. A new professor of mathematics, Evan Enright. Pleased to have a new ESL instructor, Carla Fritzler. And another counselor, Michelle Gustafson. Excited to hire our second culinary arts professor, Kathleen Lunetto. And our second mathematics new instructor, Jonathan Luke. We're excited, our first gerontology full-time instructor, Nicole Major. Another ESL instructor, Julie McGear. A counselor and our articulation specialist is going to be Amy Mucario. We're excited to have our first, again, full-time humanities instructor, Pete Murray. We're also pleased to have our first VETS coordinator and counselor. He's not in the position just yet. He's going to start in January, but that's Terrence Nelson. In our wonderful nursing program, a new professor, Jacqueline Novak. Pleased to have a new journalism instructor, Timothy Posada. And finally, to finish off our wonderful new counselor class, Lisa Tran. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Irvine Valley College has 6 new faculty that we can introduce at this time. I believe there are at least 3 that are still underway that we haven't completed yet. So to begin with is Professor of Business and Real Estate, Rick Boone. Professor of History, Henry Carney. Professor of Economics, Adam Gulam. Professor of Computer Information Management, Michael Salviani. Professor of English Composition, Deanna Scherger. And Professor of Biology, Justin Wright. Again, thank you and welcome back.
As we begin continue our list, actually, of introductions, I'd like to add to that list the very most important person in my life, my wife, Adair Portner. We also have a few new administrators and managers, and also ones that have taken on new assignments. And I'd like you to please stand, as the others have, when I call your name. Christian Alvarado, Interim Dean of Enrollment Services, Saddleback College. Christian looked like he just walked in the door when that. Mariana Amini, Interim Dean of Online Education, Saddleback College. Gary Barnack, Grants Project Manager, Health Sciences, Saddleback College. James Betancourt, Acting Assistant Director of Facilities, Irvine Valley College. Michael Betzler, Police Operations Lieutenant, Saddleback College. Christina Delgado, Director of International Student Programs, Irvine Valley College. Israel Dominguez, Director of Economic and Workforce Development, Saddleback College. Tracy Fahimi, Interim Dean, Social and Behavioral Sciences, Irvine Valley College. Georgina Guy, Interim Dean of Counseling Services, Saddleback College. Anissa Hurd Johnson, Director of Student Life, Irvine Valley College. Patrick Higa, Chief of Police, Saddleback College. Ruth Higgins, Interim Director of Financial Aid at Saddleback College. Jeffrey Hurlbut, Acting Director of Facilities, Irvine Valley College. John Jaramillo, Dean of Economic and Workforce Development. Mary Kim, Project Director, Career Technical Education, Irvine Valley College. Sarah Miko Kumasaka, Director of Outreach and Recruitment, Irvine Valley College. Albert Kennedy Lira, Assistant Dean, Financial Aid and Student Support Services. Mark Murphy, Acting Night Facilities Operations Supervisor, Irvine Valley College. Maureen Oliver, Acting Risk Manager, District Services. Elisa Oransky, Executive Director of the College Foundation at Irvine Valley College. Nicole Ortega, Interim Director of Research and Planning at Saddleback College. Joseph Pashek, Dean of Arts, Irvine Valley College. James Rondow, Director of College Broadcast Services, Saddleback College. Todd Schmaltz, Acting Police Operations Lieutenant, Irvine Valley College. Mark Shepner, Construction Manager, District Services. Louise Strowling, Manager of College Fiscal Services, Irvine Valley College. Tony Tang, Dean of Advanced Technology and Applied Science, Saddleback College. And last, Janet Vera Lopez, Director of Student Success and Support Programs at Irvine Valley College. Today, as we continue our focus on student success, we're going to explore the role of student equity. Student equity is a subject of increasing state and national attention. I've said before that student success and completion will drive and define the rest of our careers. There are many facets to student success. Before we get to our keynote presentation, I'd like to make a short update on district-wide matters. We just finished the first year of our 6-year strategic plan that takes us from 2014 to 2020. There are four overarching goals to that plan, and the District-Wide Planning Council has completed its work to refine key performance indicators to integrate the college and the district-wide plans. The four goals are: 1, the district will foster an environment characterized by creativity, innovation, respectful interactions, and collaboration. 2, the district will promote student success by enhancing the teaching and learning environment. 3, the district will advance economic workforce development through regional partnerships with educational institutions and with industry, and by strengthening career technical education. 4, the district will strengthen long-term financial health and institutional effectiveness through integrated planning and resource allocation. We are rolling out a major enterprise software system called Workday. This project began 2 years ago, and hundreds of you participated in the process to make the decision of which software that we should purchase. You have also been involved in an ongoing way in the development and rollout of that process. This is going to change the way we do business district-wide, making everyday processes more efficient. In the end, I promise you. These implementations are a big undertaking in all organizations, and some bumps in the road are expected. And there's been a concerted effort to roll out the system with plenty of training and communication and outreach. I want to thank Vice Chancellor Deborah Fitzsimmons and the entire Workday Committee for sustained dedication to this project. The group has put in many long days and nights to help make this transition. Please do your part by getting trained in the new system. The training sessions are critical. There's going to be, and there will be a lot of ongoing support. The next big focus will be accreditation. As you know, the colleges are required to do an accreditation self-evaluation every 7 years. This is a time for institutional reflection and an opportunity for us to make improvements. The accreditation agency updated its standards to include a greater focus on district services and on boards of trustees. It's also important to remember that in multi-college districts, the colleges and district services are integrated and expected to serve as one entity. We all have varying roles, but we are all one district. From a district-wide level, the college provides leadership in setting and communicating expectations of educational excellence and integrity throughout the district, and also assures the support of the effective operation of the colleges. Working with the colleges, the Chancellor establishes clearly defined roles, authority, and responsibility between the colleges and the district system. The district is governed by the Board of Trustees. There is also a new set of standards for multi-college districts that we'll be working with. So there are a number of new changes to the accreditation system and the standards that we have to report on. So we'll all be working hard on that. I have assigned 6 administrators and managers to work closely with the college committees to provide all the information that you need to help write your reports. I believe we're in pretty good shape going forward. We've cleaned up many of the fiscal and planning issues that faced us during the last accreditation cycle. And of course, there's always room for improvement, and this year of self-study will help us to identify those. Accreditation of our colleges is earned, and it is maintained by all of us working as one. That concludes my brief update. I'd like to ask Saddleback College Dean of Fine Arts, Barton McHenry, to come forward and introduce our musical performance.
Please welcome to the stage the Gliadkovsky family. I'll let them get settled. They're kind of like our resident Von Trapp family, if you will. Kirill Gliadkovsky is this year's chair of our music department and is in charge of our keyboard studies program, which includes piano, organ, and harpsichord. And Anna Gliadkovsky also teaches piano for us. Sophia Gliadkovsky and Anastasia Gliadkovsky. I think Sophia is going to be a future chancellor, without a doubt. So they will be performing for you La Noce d'Argent, The Silver Anniversary by Cécile Chaminade. Do you want to say a few words about the piece?
Yes, Cécile Chaminade is a French lady composer, one of the rare examples of successful career of a lady as a composer in the 19th century. She was super popular, was well published during her lifetime, and to this day, her pieces being performed, and this is a very unusual case. You can find pieces for 1 piano and 4 hands, no problem. And sometimes a few of them are 6 hands, 3 performers. But this one is for 1 piano, 8 hands. And let's see if this piano can handle it.
I want to assure you, we do have 25 pianos on campus, but we're glad they're economizing. Enjoy.
Wasn't that great to have a whole family perform for us that way? Student success is a vast topic, and we've strived to address it in some way in each of our Chancellor's opening sessions since 2011. Today, we're going to cover the topic of student equity, particularly as it relates to accommodating students with disabilities. Increasing our awareness and attention to this topic is not only the right thing to do, it is integral to the success for all of our students. I want to personally thank Ardith Lynch from Saddleback College and Jane Horling, Saddleback faculty and Flex Week coordinator, for suggesting the topic and introducing us to Paul. Thanks also to Student Services Vice Presidents Juan Avalos and Linda Fontanella. They are leading the student equity efforts at the colleges, and they participated in the planning phone calls that helped make the presentation more meaningful to you. Our hope is that each one of you, regardless of the role that you are filling in the colleges today, will find this topic useful, helpful, and thought-provoking. Now let me tell you a little bit about Paul. Due to his own learning disabilities, Paul dropped out of college in his sophomore year. Later, when he returned to college, Paul was more successful, and he graduated near the top of his law school class at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. From there, he went on to study philosophy of law at Oxford University. He is licensed to practice law in the state of California and in the state of Wisconsin. For over 40 years, Paul served as a civil rights attorney with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Civil Rights. For 30 years of that time, he served as chief regional attorney in the San Francisco office, supervising 25 attorneys. Paul has worked on every type of school discrimination matters, including school desegregation, sex discrimination in intercollegiate athletics, equal education opportunity for language minority children, and securing a free, appropriate public education for children with disabilities. For nearly 20 years, Paul also had lead responsibility for internal disability law training within the Office of Civil Rights. Paul worked in OCR headquarters during the writing of the first disability anti-discrimination regulation. In San Francisco, he witnessed the historic 504 sit-in at United Nations Plaza, and I'm assuming Paul will tell us what that means. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act essentially stated that no program receiving federal funds could discriminate against students with disabilities or a person with disabilities. During his career, Paul investigated, wrote decisions, settled hundreds of disability discrimination cases, and in many instances developed new approaches to handling students with disabilities. Towards the end of his Office of Civil Rights career, Paul focused on 3 issues. 1, students with ADHD. 2, students with disabilities in post-secondary education. And 3, wounded warriors in higher education. Paul played a key role in the developing and securing 2 precedent-setting settlements regarding the duty to produce alternate media. One of those cases was with the California Community College system. Another was with the California State University at Fullerton. Paul has been an advisor to the Office of the Vice President of the United States and to the Office of the California Community College Chancellor. on the topic of wounded warriors in higher education. A high proportion of our wounded warriors have disabilities, and Paul will cover that today. Paul is an adjunct professor of disability law at Hastings Law School, University of California. He is a member of the board of directors for the Association on Higher Education and Disability, also the Public Policy Committee of the Association for Children and Adults with ADHD, and the Disability Rights Advocates Expert Advisory Board. He is extensively published, including 2 textbooks. He is nationally recognized as a speaker, and we are pleased to host him today. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Paul.
Thank you very much. Good morning. That's kind of a tough act to follow. I have only 2 hands, right? Mr. Chancellor, thank you very much for the introduction. And fellow teaching colleagues, I've been teaching at Hastings for 20 years in addition to my 40 years with OCR. And by the way, that's concurrent. They run concurrent. And I'm very, very happy to be with you this morning. And because of my very, very fortunate career opportunity to work for the Office for Civil Rights for 40 years, I've really watched American civil rights history, particularly with regard to education, unfold before my very eyes. And indeed, when I first came to OCR, there was no disability law. There was actually not even any anti-sex discrimination law. It was all about race. And I was able to see how we went from race to national origin, to sex, to disability. And from my perspective, and one of the main points that I want to make with you this morning is disability rights is a civil right. Equity with regard to disability is about equity. When we think of equity, we really need to be thinking about all of these categories. And from my perspective, they have very similar characteristics. And I'll note it's the 25th anniversary of the ADA. It's the 40th anniversary of Section 504. And this college has been subject to the requirements of non-discrimination on the basis of disability now for 40 years. The Chancellor went over my vita, so I think I will skip that, and we don't need to be too legalistic. I guess the one legal thing I need to do this morning is to say, yes, it's a Pepsi, so we're okay. So, do you all know what a TED Talk is? Yeah. Okay, so we're going to start with a TED Talk, and then we're going to go into some civil rights history, and then we're going to go into some civil rights law substance. But let's start with the TED Talk, and I promise this is the only narcissistic part of my presentation. I'm actually going to talk about 3 different stories, but I am going to start with my own. So as the Chancellor explained, I was a college dropout. And essentially I was a college dropout because in those days there was no such thing as reasonable accommodation in higher education. And as an individual with dyslexia, there's probably no skill that is more difficult to accomplish than learning a foreign language. And that's because dyslexia is a language processing disorder. It's not really very much about visual. I know in the press they talk about, oh, the letters look upside down and they jumble on the page. And that may be true for some individuals, but it's really about the ability to process language in the brain. And because that's the part of the brain which is least effective for some individuals, learning a second language is a particularly difficult challenge. And so while I was doing okay in most of my classes, I was staying up all night trying to learn Spanish. And I think it's important for most people to learn a second language, but I wish I had had as an accommodation reading the literature of Spain or studying the economy of Mexico or something of that nature. But that opportunity was not available to me. And so I tried to go without sleep, and that experiment failed, and I had pneumonia and mononucleosis at the same time. I nearly passed away. I was in the hospital for several months. And I thought about just giving up on going to school altogether. And when I came back to kind of close out my account, I was required to have an exit interview with a guidance counselor, and the guidance counselor taught me the key to success in education, which is that if you join the Italian club, you get the exam the night before. And with that key to success in education, I was able to go on. And the strange part is, the first 2 semesters, first 2 years, I was a C- student and a dropout. The second 2 years, I was a straight A student. And I graduated near the top of my law school class. And so when I go talk to parents, all the LD mothers want to know, how did you change your diet? No, I didn't change my diet. I didn't change at all. What changed was what you all valued. Because education, the first 2 years of college, valued short-term memory skills, how well I could do on a multiple choice exam. Education, the last 2 years, valued analytical skills, clarity, thinking outside the box, succinctness, all the kind of skills that for me were strengths. Now this is what I want you to think about from my own story. How many students who have the potential to be great, anything but a math teacher, are never going to go on in their career because, and I don't know what the rule is at this school, so I'm not picking on anyone, they can't use a calculator in consumer math? How many are not going to be able to go on because they can't master a foreign language? Every time we are reluctant to accommodate individuals with disabilities, we're assuming that the way the human brain works is you're strong evenly across all areas of cognition. But the truth is, for some of us, the human brain is more like this. And because we want to be able to have professions and practice skills, and we have educational ambitions that go on as to our strengths, we need your support and your flexibility as to our weaknesses. And so I want to ask you to think about the question when a student wants an accommodation and you feel uncomfortable about it. Are you an enabler or are you a gatekeeper? And if you're a gatekeeper, I want you to think about, why am I being a gatekeeper? And maybe the issue for you is one of safety. Well, that's an important issue, a legitimate one. Maybe for you the issue is a fundamental alteration, and the law allows for that. But I want you to think long and hard before you become a gatekeeper. And I will hope in most instances, working creatively with the Disabled Student Services Office, you can in fact become an enabler. Okay. Mary Lee Vance, PhD. God, I wish Mary Lee was with me today. So Mary Lee is my business partner. She's also Deputy Director of Disabled Student Services at Cal Berkeley. And as you can understand, students at Cal Berkeley have some pretty high expectations as individuals with disabilities. So she has a pretty responsible job. Mary Lee is 4'11". She rides a scooter. She has post-polio syndrome, and she was kidnapped out of Korea as a child because the kidnapping entity, I think with only the best intentions, knew that if she stayed in Korea, she would die. And so she was brought to the United States, and she was adopted by an American doctor. And success story, she has a PhD. But Mary Lee, being only 4'11" and having almost no use of her legs, wearing about 40 pounds of braces on a fairly small frame to begin with, has some mobility challenges. And so, of course, she has a disability parking sticker. So Mary Lee and I are presenting in Santa Monica, and we have a nice presentation, and we decide to go out for dinner, and we park in a handicapped parking space, and we put up her hang tag, and we have our dinner, and we come back, and there is a $750 parking ticket. It's 11 o'clock at night, and typical of how Mary Lee and I balance one another out, I'm cursing, and she's telling me, oh, let's go to the police department and see if we can take care of this ticket. And I have to tell you, as a former Oakland police officer, I don't think there's a chance in hell that's going to happen, right? So nonetheless, we drive over to the police department, and I'm in a van, because that's how we carry her scooter, and I say, Mary Lee, wait here, I'll go in, I'll see if I can talk him out of the ticket. And she says, no way. And she gets on her Canadian crutches, and she very dramatically walks with me up to the podium at the police station. And I swear, by the time we get up there, they're already willing to tear up the ticket, right? And we find the individual who gave us the ticket, who, fortunately, she was still on duty, and we show her the hang tag, and she said, well, you had a California license plate, you had a Wisconsin hang tag, I thought it was a fake, and I'm very sorry. And she says, you know, normally, when I undo a ticket, and I'm going to undo yours, I make the people do all the paperwork. She says, I'm going to do the paperwork for you. Good night. So I'm thinking, okay, Mary Lee, you were right. So we go back to the van, and I get in the van, and Mary Lee turns to me and she says, Paul, I want you to go back into that police department and thank that woman for giving us the ticket. And I'm thinking, I'm going to walk around the block. She's never going to know. And I said, okay, Mary Lee, why in the world should I thank that woman for the ticket? And she says, you know perfectly well, as we drive all over the state, we have a really hard time getting a parking space because there are so many cheaters. And if that policewoman didn't aggressively enforce the law, there'd be no parking spaces for us, right? Not my insight. Her insight. Her insight, because as an individual with a disability, she had perspectives which I didn't have, and I'm willing to guess most of you didn't have until I told you the story. And that's why the anthem of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And I want you to hold on to that anthem as we're thinking about equity, and why equity for individuals with disabilities is an extremely important part of our equity responsibilities. And finally, I want to tell you the story of my brother, who's no longer with us. So my brother was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And now non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is a fairly treatable form of cancer, but when he had it, it was not treatable at all. And the doctor told him, Richard, you might have a year to live. And he had to make a decision. What was he going to do with that last year of his life? And he did the most strange, perverse thing I can imagine. He enrolled in law school. And thanks to 2 bone marrow transplants, he completed law school, he passed the New Jersey bar, he argued his first case, and he passed away. And I sat with him in the hospice, and I said to him, Richard, that was a very unusual decision you made to go to law school, knowing that your days on earth were limited. Was it the right decision? And he said, for me, absolutely, it was the best decision. He said, when you have cancer, dying is a process. You lose, step by step, the traditional indicia of life. You lose the ability to walk, which he did pretty early in his cancer. You don't get to go to the bathroom the way most people do. You don't get to make love the way most people do. You don't get to eat the way most people do. But if you can still read, write, argue, think, analyze, engage in intellectual exchange with other individuals, your humanity is affirmed and you are still alive. It is still important that you are on earth. And I think about this in terms of the work I do with wounded warriors. Because to be honest, and I work with some of the most severely disabled wounded warriors, and I want every one of them to go to college. Every one of them. For many of those individuals, they're never going to be employable. They may not even want to be employable. What they want is to be affirmed as human beings, to read, write, think, and learn. And I know that community college is all about preparing people for employment or going on to a four-year institution. I know higher ed is always about research and employment. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes the most honorable thing we can do is work with individuals who aren't employable or so disabled, but they are here for the human enrichment and the human experience that is part of the most honorable objectives of education. And so again, I would like you to think about the question, am I an enabler or am I a gatekeeper? And sometimes worrying about employment really isn't the most important criteria to keep in mind. Okay. It's a civil rights mission. There are many benefits to equity for students with disabilities. And I know you're sitting here in this college environment and you're thinking, man, we've made a lot of progress with regard to individuals with disabilities. Things now are radically different from how they were 20 years ago, and they are. I would not have been a college dropout if I was able to go to school now. But I want you to know, things for individuals with disabilities in this country ain't so good. Let's start with employment. The unemployment rate for individuals with disabilities when the ADA passed 25 years ago was 50%. Today it's 50%. No improvement whatsoever. For individuals with psychiatric disabilities, it's 87%. And by the way, the dropout rate for students with psychiatric disabilities is about twice that of students with all other forms of disability. Transit in America, what a disaster. You go to New York City, 2/3 of the subway stations are inaccessible to individuals with disabilities. In most cities, a paratransit cab is so hard to get, so unreliable, and so expensive, it is not a realistic way to get to work. When I went to Austin, Texas with Dr. Vance to deliver a presentation about wounded warriors, we never made it to the presentation because we couldn't find an accessible way to get there. Because there were a few accessible cabs in Austin, and none of them had an airport sticker, so they couldn't come to the airport. Want to know why there's 50% unemployment for individuals with disabilities? Maybe it's inaccessible transit. What is the mental health care system in the United States of America? Prison. That's our mental health care system. It was very interesting to listen to the Rikers Island, Rikers is the big prison off of New York City, explain, the Rikers Island commissioner explained, he runs the biggest mental health care system facility in the United States of America. There's a lot in the news about violence between police and communities of color, particularly the African American community. It's a real issue. It's actually why I was once an Oakland police officer, because I wanted to work on that very issue. But I think the press is missing a very big issue, which is many of the people who are involved in those shootings are actually individuals with disabilities. Because the police are just as poorly trained in how to deal with individuals with psychiatric disabilities as they are on how to deal with youth of color. And the truth is, as a civil rights issue, this is a crossover issue which needs to be addressed on both bases. Voting. The heart of democracy. If you can't vote, you have no influence in the society. 80% of all voting booths in New York City are inaccessible to individuals with disabilities. Alameda County, where I live, every single precinct has an accessible voting machine. But nobody knew how to turn them on. Nobody knew how to operate them. We spent a lot of money on those machines. Not a single one was available in the last election. Emergency planning. Does your college have an emergency evacuation plan? If you have, God forbid, a shooter on campus or a forest fire or an earthquake, do you have an evacuation plan? Well, let me ask you a second question to think about. Does your evacuation plan specifically provide for evacuation of individuals with disabilities? LA spent many, many millions of dollars putting together an evacuation plan. Not one sentence on what they were going to do to evacuate individuals with disabilities. New York City, exact same situation. Technology. Technology is a wonderful thing, and it can be very enabling for individuals with disabilities, or it can be exactly how they're further excluded from society. Is your online learning system accessible to people who are deaf or blind? I don't know the answer to that question, but I can tell you it's being litigated about every third or fourth higher ed disability case right now is about access to technology. How many people love Uber? Yeah, Uber's great with this one problem. If you're blind, you can't use the technology, and if you show up with a seeing eye dog, they won't let you get in the cab. A problem. It could be great, but it actually will be one more barrier unless we're very affirmative and aggressive about it. Beyond our shores. So I will give the United States of America credit for this fact. We are better about disability anti-discrimination law and its enforcement than any other country in the world. We are the model. And when I visit Cambodia somewhat regularly, because that's where I adopted my daughter from, I see what it's like to be in a country where there's no disability law whatsoever. So the UN passed a convention, and the UN convention was about the rights of individuals with disabilities throughout the world. And the convention was based on the ADA. What's the one industrial country in the world that will not adopt the ADA convention? The United States of America. So what's my point? Nothing about us without us. We must invest in equity for individuals with disabilities and be committed to equity for individuals with disabilities, because that alone is the way we're going to address the other problems which I've just raised this morning. Here's some good news. The good news is, sorry, I just want to check my time. The good news is, statistically speaking, when you educate, when you give a higher education to an individual with a disability, more than any other discrete group of individuals, they benefit from that education. This is a good investment. So the unemployment rate for individuals who graduate from college is 25% less than it is for individuals with disabilities who don't go to college or don't graduate from college. And that's a larger improvement than for any other, for women, for people of color, for white males, whatever. So this is a worthwhile effort. Okay. Disability is a form of diversity. You know, the Supreme Court of the United States is very reluctant to endorse race-based affirmative action, but it has not ruled it out altogether. Why? Because it recognizes the value and importance of diversity in the classroom. What I want you to understand is individuals with disabilities are also an element of diversity in the classroom. When I teach my disability law class at Hastings, and a student holds up his or her hand and says, "Professor Grossman, you have no idea what it's like to be involuntarily committed in California." Yeah, thank God I don't. But I want my class to know about this, and I want my students with disabilities to explain it to everyone else. So I am a strong supporter of diversity on all bases, including individuals with disabilities. If we educate individuals with disabilities in higher ed, they go into the professions. The same diversity argument that exists for race or gender. And we have our unique needs as well. So I'm in my senior undergraduate year at the University of Wisconsin, and I've been living with the same girlfriend for 2 years, and we're in the same jam that comes along for all young males who've been living with their girlfriends for 2 years. When are we going to get married? Right? And actually, it probably was time to get married, right? But I was having a lot of trouble committing to that concept. So I went into the counseling center, and I had a counselor, and the counselor asked all the logical questions, except for the important one, asked all the logical questions. How did your mom and dad get along with? What was your relationship with your mom? Did your dad ever hit your mom? Did they ever divorce? Blah, 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 blah. Never did she ask me this question, which was the right question. Are you afraid, as an individual with a disability, that you won't be able to support a family? And that's what I was afraid of. And that's what kept me from making the commitment. But as a professional, she was of no value to me and my needs. I needed an individual with a disability who had walked the walk and had that insight. And I have the story of Bonnie Tucker, who originally was an inhalation therapist. So Bonnie walks into the inhalation ward, and everybody comes up to her. And these are all people who recently had laryngectomy. So they have a hole here, and they haven't yet learned how to speak. They don't have a speaking device yet. And they're all descending on Bonnie and asking her questions. And one person asked Bonnie, can she kind of translate to his wife, because he wants to talk to his wife. And one of them starts to cry, and Bonnie says, "Why are you crying?" And he says, "Bonnie, don't you understand you're the only person who knows what we're saying?" Why? Because Bonnie's deaf. And Bonnie can read lips. And she was the one and only person in that health science field who was able to actually serve the individuals she was working with. Okay. I learn in a different way. And if you're going to meet my needs as an individual with a disability, you're going to need to teach in a different way. Here's the good news. That will improve the quality of your teaching. And I take the case of Boston University. So Boston University was sued by a group of LD students, and there was Boston 1 and Boston 2. In Boston 1, the students proved that the university was purposely refusing to identify them as individuals with disabilities, so it did not have to give them accommodations. And the court really threw the book at Boston. Boston 2, the school won. What was the issue in Boston 2? The issue in Boston 2 was Boston had stopped giving course substitutions in foreign languages. Now, you know how I feel about this issue, right? And all these LD kids have been taking literature of Spain. All of a sudden, now they had to take Spanish. And Boston came into court and told the court, "Your Honor, you have no business second-guessing an academic decision like, will we or won't we require students to actually learn Spanish or French?" And the court said, "That's true, but if I sit on my hands, then what was the point of having the law?" So here's the compromise. I want you to form a committee. I want you to put on that committee people who are in the foreign language department, but also people who aren't in the foreign language department. And I want you to identify the goals that will be achieved from teaching people French or Spanish. And then I want you to ask this question: is there any other way we can achieve those goals? So they did the study, and they came back to the court, and they told the court, Your Honor, we've decided there is no other way to achieve intimacy with another culture than to be able to speak its own language. But in the course of looking at this issue, we found 4 new ways to teach foreign language. And we're now going to have multiple sections in each of our primary foreign languages so that students can pick the approach to teaching which they are most likely to be successful in. That's the advantage of diversity. That's the advantage of the innovation that comes from meeting the needs of these students. Now, of course, all students may benefit from these changes. This is more universal equity than just equity for students with disabilities. And that gets me to the ultimate curricular innovation, universal design. Because universal design posits, let's do things in the classroom that make it unnecessary to go to disabled student services. Because we're now going to provide historically what's been called an accommodation generally for every student. So let me talk to you about how I do it in my classroom. Rubber meets the road. In my classroom, every single lecture is recorded. I know there are teachers that are very uptight about having their classes recorded. I'm not sure why, because at Harvard, they put almost all their classes up on the internet. At Stanford, they put a huge portion of their classes up on the internet. So I'm not sure what the issue exactly is, but I'm happy to have all my classes recorded. And by the way, all the classes at Hastings are recorded. My textbook is in multiple formats. I wrote the textbook for my class, and if you're a blind person, you don't need to go to DSS to have it converted. It's already available to you in an accessible format. My syllabus is produced at least 6 weeks in advance. Why? So if anybody needs to have something as an accommodation, they can work with Disabled Student Services well in advance. I have PowerPoints for every one of my classes. I distribute my PowerPoints to my students in advance on the internet, and I leave them up for the rest of the semester. Students may take either of 2 forms of exam in my class, either write a research paper or take an in-class exam. If you write the research paper, you can turn it in 3 weeks in advance, and I will help you edit it, and I will return it back to you. Oh, isn't that cheating? No. I'm teaching you how to be a better writer, which is my objective in the first place, right? Law school, by the way, is a great big reading and writing clinic. That's really all it is. That's why lots more dyslexic people should be going there, because that's the skills they need to work on, right? If you want to take the in-class exam, all students are allowed to bring in 2 sheets of paper on which they can write anything they want. Court decisions, paradigms, analytical approaches, I don't care. Why? Because I'm not interested in doing a short-term memory skill test. I'm interested in looking at your analytical skills, at your writing skills. That's what, can you spot all the issues? That's what matters to me. So bring in the 2 sheets of paper. And here's the most important innovation of all. My exam has no time limit. Don't need to go to DSS to get time and a half. All students have no time limit. Wait a minute, you'll be there till 2 in the morning. And not likely, really. Think about who's going to be writing till 2 in the morning. But more importantly, I have a word limit. Why? Because when you file a brief in the 9th Circuit of the United States, they have a word limit. So why not give an exam that most closely simulates what's expected of you as a professional? And again, this approach applies to every single student. It's universal design. Okay, And of course, another reason to provide equity to the students is because it's the law. So let's go over the laws very quickly. There's Section 504, which is now 40 years old, and it's because you get federal financial assistance. There's Title I of the ADA, which protects you, not the students. It's about employment discrimination. And maybe it's important for you to recognize that when we are aggressive about enforcing the ADA, we're sticking up for you, because eventually, I hate to tell all of you, but I once had a 32-inch waistline and hair down to my shoulders. We all age, right? Okay. Title II of the ADA applies to you all, because you are a public institution. So even if you didn't get a dime of federal financial assistance, the law would still be applying to you. And Title III applies to private entities. And here's why Title III matters to you. Because many of you have worked really, really hard to get students on the road to professions. The real estate profession, policing, becoming doctors and lawyers eventually. And what you ought to be aware of, because it's a sad truth, many of those bright individuals who you think will make great lawyers never get to pass the bar because they can't get accommodations on the bar exam. Well, Title III now says you must provide reasonable accommodation on those big scale exams as well. So the investment that you're making is now much more likely to pay off. So what's covered here at your school? Well, to save myself a little time, I'm just going to tell you everything is covered. Not just your academic activities, but your non-academic activities, your celebrations, your events, your research services. Whatever you do or have going on here is covered. And not only are just students with disabilities covered, but parents who visit here, people who attend your public events are covered. There's really, I just think the easiest, safest way to think about it is everything is covered. Now, there's even one more way to reach out, which is when you have clinical placements, you're responsible for what goes on at those clinical placements, even though they're not really directly your program. And by the way, a lot of complaints come to the Office for Civil Rights because colleges and universities say, I agree that shouldn't have gone on, but I don't run that clinic. It's not my program. And then I'm going to ask you, well, what did you see? What did you do to ensure that whatever the problem was, it doesn't go on? And so your responsibilities extend a long distance. By the way, one way in which your responsibilities do not extend is to overseas programs. Once a student leaves the shores of the United States, your ADA duties do not continue with that student. And I think we've covered this. Okay. Equity for individuals with disabilities is a hard-won, well-established legal concept. And I want to say this sentence, and then we're going to explain the sentence. Identical treatment is not always equal treatment. And if you look at the picture on the left, it's about identical treatment. If you look at the picture on the right, the goal is equity. And there is a difference here, and I want to focus on this difference. So how many of you are old enough to remember James Burke's program, Connections? Nobody? God, am I the oldest person in this room? Woo! Okay. So I'll just tell you about James Burke's program. He would start with the silk loom, and he would explain how the invention of the silk loom would get you all the way to the invention of the IBM computer. And he would take you in each step. And he would get you to see there would be no IBM computer if there had not originally been a silk loom. So in the James Burke sense, I want to ask, what do the rights of a few monolingual, Cantonese-speaking children in Chinatown, San Francisco have to do with your job? And the answer is everything. And I'm going to take you there. Okay, so I want to talk about 4 stages in civil rights law, and I lived through every one of them. And of course, the first stage is the Emancipation Proclamation. And the second stage is ending de jure segregation, and I had the great honor of desegregating schools in the state of Arkansas. And it was a really interesting experience. And I'm very grateful for the fact that in those days, the FBI used to work with us, because every now and then they would call me and say, Paul, you need to leave town. You know, it was a different stage in our civil rights history. I'm grateful I got to live through it, but I'm very grateful we're never going to go back there. So the next stage is what's called the disparate treatment stage, and I think it's where lots of people's minds are still stuck. So disparate treatment is like this. You have a law firm. The law firm has a large clerical pool. The rule is 1 hour for lunch, but white clerical people in San Francisco always need 1 hour 15, 1 hour 20, because restaurants are crowded and the food doesn't come on time, and so to be reasonable, everybody gets 1 hour 15, 1 hour 20. And an African American clerical gets fired for taking more than 1 hour for lunch. I'm sure that offends everyone, and the violation of the law is obvious. Similarly situated people ought to be treated the same. It's a good legal principle. It applies in a lot of situations. It even applies to individuals with disabilities, because when individuals engage in a hostile environment on the basis of disability, it's this principle that's being violated. But that's not the final stage of development of the law. The next stage is called disparate impact. And if I had 1 hour extra, I could tell you in detail about Griggs v. Duke Power. But essentially, Duke Power was in Georgia. It practiced discrimination in hiring, particularly in the good-paying jobs, race discrimination. And once the Civil Rights Act of 1972 passed, of course, employment discrimination was illegal, and Duke Power said, okay, now how can we fairly and objectively make selections for these higher paying, more responsible positions? And Duke Power said, we're going to use objective selection criteria. You must have a high school diploma and get a score of higher than 21 on the Otis Quick Intelligence Test. And to Duke's credit, if you were an African American male and met that criteria, you'd get the job. And if you were a white male and didn't meet that criteria, you wouldn't get the job. And if we were stuck at the last stage of civil rights, there'd be nothing wrong with that, right? Similarly situated people are being treated the same regardless of race. Here's the problem. If you're an African American male in Georgia, you have 1/4 the chance of having a high school diploma and 1/11 the chance of having a score of 21 or higher on the Otis Quick Intelligence Test. Now, Supreme Court made it clear, if having a high school diploma and having that score was predictive of who would do these upper level jobs well, you could still use that criteria. The problem was, those criteria had nothing to do with who would do that job well. How did they know that? Because most of the people Duke Power held those jobs never had a high school diploma and never passed the Otis Quick Intelligence Test. White people. So the Supreme Court said, you know, sometimes we have an unnecessary headwind, something that's on its face looks important, looks objective, looks like you're upholding meritocracy. But in fact, it's not predictive of success. And I want you to think about your criteria, what you're upholding as important, and ask yourself, is it a necessary criteria or is it an unnecessary headwind? So this gets us to answer the James Burke question. Because once we had Griggs v. Duke Power, the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights issued what's called a Dear Colleague letter. And that letter posits this: if you come to the starting line with the same skills as everyone else, great. But if you come to the starting line with something that is unique and different, like you don't speak English at all, that has to be taken into account. So we sued San Francisco Unified School District because it was treating all students exactly the same, identical treatment. And San Francisco said, wait a minute, Paul, you go into Chinatown, our teachers are just as experienced. We spend the same dollars per student. The walls are painted with the same paint. They're equally air-conditioned or un-air-conditioned. The library has the same number of books. How could we be engaging in discrimination? And the answer is, because all your monolingual Cantonese-speaking kids are dropping out. Because you're failing to address what's unique to them. I helped prepare the Solicitor General of the United States for the argument before the Supreme Court in this case. And when the decision came down, oh, happy day. Because what the court said was, well, if we were to define discrimination, we might not see it this way. But U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, you have experience in this area. You have vision in this area. You've been empowered by Congress to regulate this area. And if you want to say taking these individual characteristics into account is necessary in order to provide equity, you can do so. The very next day, we started writing the 504 regulations, because now we knew we had the authority to raise the concept of reasonable accommodation. Without civil rights for people of color, without civil rights for language minority populations, there'd be no disability rights. I get that, and I want all my students to get it. But it's also true, we are now part of the definition of equity. All right, I want to talk to you about the first Supreme Court case on disability discrimination, because it makes some very important points that I want you to all understand. So you have a licensed vocational nurse who's deaf. She can read lips very well. And she's done a good job as an LVN. Now she wants to become an RN, and she tries to enroll in a community college program. And they interview her, and they realize, hey, she's deaf. So they did a very smart thing. They did not tell her, you cannot come into this program. They told her, we need to think about this. And they asked her, well, how would we deal with this problem or that problem? So one of the ones they asked her about was, we teach surgical nursing. It's part of our degree. People wear face masks. How are you going to read lips in surgical nursing? And she said, well, under 504, you can't require me to master that skill because it's because of my disability. And the school said, thank you, we're going to think about this. And they called 12 other schools and asked them, have you ever had a deaf nursing student? How did you educate her? What did you do about these various safety concerns that we have? And all 12 schools said, no, we haven't done it, and we're not sure how we would do it. Then they called the State Licensing Commission, and they got essentially the same answer. So then they called her back, and they said, we're very sorry, but we think the ability to work in the surgical arena is an essential, fundamental skill. We haven't found a way you could do it, and we're not going to admit you to our program. And she sued them for disability discrimination, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, given that you carefully looked at this issue on a case-by-case basis, given that you identified what were your essential academic requirements, and given that at this time we could not find a way to accommodate that, you do not have to lower your academic standards, and you're entitled to uphold that requirement, and as a matter of safety, not admit that nurse to the program. But there's more, and I want you to hear the more as well. First thing I've told you is you don't have to lower academic standards. But there's more, and here's the more. First of all, the Supreme Court distinguished between essential and non-essential requirements. So you need to think about what's essential and what's not essential before you uphold a requirement as was upheld in this program. The second thing the court said is, the fact that you've done something for years and years and years doesn't mean it will always be essential. Tradition doesn't alone mean that it's an immutable rule. And the third thing they said was, technology may change something that's essential to something that's not essential, or something that's not accommodatable to something that is accommodatable. And the reason this is significant is because here's now my experience in nursing. If you're a deaf nurse, instead of using an auditory stethoscope, now you use a visual stethoscope. And it turns out visual stethoscopes are better diagnostic tools than our auditory stethoscopes. And at those nursing schools where they're now admitting deaf individuals, everyone wants to use the visual stethoscope. Okay. A little social history, so because I'm behind, I'm going to be very quick. Section 504 is snuck. There's no, is that the past tense of to sneak? Now it is. Okay, thank you. Is placed surreptitiously into an omnibus funding bill. Nobody knew the first disability rights law was even in the bill. It passed, and wham, it's the law. But here's the thing I can tell you as a lawyer. A law without a regulation is of no value whatsoever. Okay? You need a regulation. So we went to work writing the regulations. I was there in Washington at the time. And Nixon was president, and he had other things on his plate, and the regulations didn't get out. And Gerald Ford was famous for not accomplishing much while president. This is one of the things he did not accomplish. Jimmy Carter is elected, and Jimmy Carter had promised the disability community, hey, you support me, I'll issue the regs, but he didn't. So God bless all those troublemakers at UC Berkeley. UC Berkeley did a really dangerous thing. They decided to admit severely disabled individuals with undergraduate degrees to their graduate programs at Cal Berkeley. And they did it by taking a floor of Cowell Hospital and converting it to a dorm. Can you imagine what a pressure cooker that is? All these angry individuals with disabilities who can't get jobs, who can't find a graduate school to admit them, and they can't get these regulations out. So what do? Well, they do what they learned from the civil rights movements that they had been in with regard to race and gender. That's my office right there. And they had a huge demonstration at 50 United Nations Plaza, so that's our 50 United Nations Plaza. And here they are outside and they're speaking, and then they asked this question, could we come in the building and meet with the Secretary's regional representative? And I was in that meeting where I was saying, you know, these are really fragile people. They're going to need their attendance. They're going to need their medication. They're going to need their catheters. Sure, let's let them in because they can't stay very long. 3 weeks later, the Secretary's regional representative is gone, but they're still there. And now they're on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, right? And they're beginning to educate the nation about this issue. And a few of them fly to Washington, D.C., and by the way, to get on and off the plane, in those days they had to go through the food service truck because there was no way otherwise for people with disabilities to fly. They take off their braces and crutches and they crawl up the stairs of the United States Capitol because it is an inaccessible building. And again, they're on the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And the next day, they all go to Secretary Califano's home and they picket. And I don't know whether this is the truth or urban folklore because I was not there, but I'm told Califano's wife told him it's either the regs or me. And the regs were issued. Okay. Some basic principles about reasonable accommodation that I want to share with you because they're important. And I think we're going to start with this. A reasonable accommodation means that you are addressing a functional limitation in a student that is the result of a disability. So it's something that's necessary, but it also must be effective. And it must be effective in order to give the student the same opportunity. I didn't say outcome, right? It's not a guarantee of a good grade, right? That's not the measure. The measure is the same opportunity to meet your academic and technical standards. Your academic standards are like, GPA. Your technical standards might be ability to lift 25 pounds, but here's a little secret. Another technical standard is ability to comply with your code of conduct. Okay? So with accommodation, when necessary, you will provide these accommodations. And here's something that often doesn't get understood. It may be an exception to a long-standing written rule. So you have a student who, their bipolar depression comes on, and they're in the 8th week of class and they want to drop out, and you say, I'm sorry, but if you drop out after the 3rd week, we have to give you an F. Go look at the rule book. That's failing to understand the duty to accommodate, which may include exceptions to well-written rules. And my favorite example of this is PGA versus Martin. So Martin is a top-level PGA golfer, and his heart will not pump blood up from his feet back into his heart, so he wears these extremely tight, extremely uncomfortable socks. And the socks squeeze the blood back up to his heart. And he has the audacity to say, I'd like an electric cart at the top level of PGA golfing. When God handed down the tablets of St. Andrews, in stone it says no electric cart. Right? No electric cart. But when this issue went to the Supreme Court of the United States, they made a fatal error that you learn in like your first year of law school. Count the justices. 5 elderly justices who play golf. Right? And the 5 elderly justices said, the essence of golfing is shot making, not walking from hole to hole. Give him his cart. Okay? So you really have to think a little beyond what's in your rule book, or just because it's published or written doesn't mean it's in gold. Nothing is inherently exempt from the duty to accommodate. Not papers to be done at home, not internships, not laboratory exercises. So what are you going to do about the student who's entitled to double time, and you're a math class, and your homework is due every Friday? And the student says, well, I want to be able to turn in my homework 2 weeks from now or 3 weeks from now because I'm entitled to extra time. That's not going to work. It's a fundamental alteration. Why? Because the skills you learn this week are necessary for the skills you're going to work the next week, right? Continuity in the skills. But why not let the student turn in their homework the next Monday morning, right? There's no fundamental alteration in that. So you have to think this through case by case, issue by issue, circumstance by circumstance. Generalizations will not work. Okay, is anything not reasonable? Well, we know from Southeastern versus Davis, fundamental alterations and lowering of academic standards. What about undue burden? So undue burden in most people's mind is cost. And I don't mean to be rude, but I have to tell you, as a public community college, the courts aren't going to give a damn what it costs. Let's take the example of an interpreter. Interpreters are very expensive. I don't know what you pay for your interpreters. It's not unusual to pay $30,000 to $40,000 a year for one student. And your budget for DSS, I'm being hypothetical, is $90,000. Well, that'll allow you to have 3 interpreters, only you need 5. No public school could successfully argue, I'm sorry, but that'll bust our DSS budget. Because the court is going to look at your full, complete, total budget and ask what percentage does $30,000 make of your total, complete, full budget. And I'm willing to guess it's like, less than 1%. Right? And it's just not going to work. So forget that argument is my basic advice. But fundamental alteration, lowering academic standards, that's important. And if that's your issue, then you need to be discussing it carefully among yourselves, as they did in Southeastern versus Davis with your DSS office, because you do not have to lower your academic standards. Okay. You do not have to provide personal services to any individual. So when individuals are in elementary and secondary school, they may have personal attendants pushing them around, dressing, undressing them, turning pages on their book, pulling books down from the bookshelf. That's not something you have to provide. But I do know full well that many wounded warriors need these services, and I hope that you will be helping them to locate individuals who can provide personal services. What's the consequence of not giving a reasonable accommodation? Well, if the court concludes it's a fundamental alteration, you're home free. But if, on the other hand, you promise an accommodation and you don't give it, or you deny an accommodation and should have given it, the burden of proof is on you to show that the student would be unqualified even if they had gotten the accommodation, which is a very speculative matter. So my advice is, if you can accommodate, give it. If you can't accommodate, try to give alternate accommodations that are not a fundamental alteration, because you do not want to be in the position of bearing the burden of proof. You would much rather be in the position where the student has to prove he or she is a qualified individual, rather than you having to prove they're an unqualified individual. Okay. I'm going to be very quick about this as well. Here's what I want you to know. The single most litigated issue in post-secondary disability law right now is information technology. What you put up on the internet, what you use as your academic courseware, how your email system works, how students register for classes, how students buy tickets to performances. All of those services must be accessible to individuals with disabilities, blind individuals and deaf individuals. So that means if your websites are primarily pictures or PDF documents, if that's what you're posting, blind individuals cannot read those documents, and they need to have tags so that when they use adaptive technology, they can read the same documents as everyone else can, or use the same services as everyone else can. And I don't know how far along your school is on this issue. I'm actually hoping this afternoon that I'm going to meet with some of your information technology people. But if you're running your own website and filling it with PDFs, you may be cruising for a problem, and you're going to need to get some technical assistance on that issue. My last issue, veterans and wounded warriors, an issue I care about very deeply, and I understand that this campus is very committed on this issue. So I come not to criticize, but just to share some very brief insights. First of all, these are individuals who bring a lot of cultural assets. And I'll just give you one example because it was an experience I really enjoyed. So I like to present wounded warriors as a panel to faculty senates and gatherings like this. I think they speak for themselves much better than I could. Nothing about us without us, right? And about 40% of all veterans are individuals with disabilities. But culturally, they don't want to go to DSS services. So I try to have these panels so that we can get this communication going. So anyway, I'm talking to one of these individuals, and I asked him, what is the moment you feel most uncomfortable in coming to college? And he says, entering my math class. And I said, well, I hate to tell you this, man, but that's true for about 80% of the people. Right? So what's the big... And he says, no. This unit is going down. So I understand unit orientation, right? You think about your colleagues. You put them just as important as you are ahead of you. And he says, I'm the only kid in my class who's doing his homework. Everybody else shows up unprepared, and it makes me feel sick. I'm going, you know, you're just the person I want in my math class. right? So you have to understand there is a commitment to public service. There's a commitment to doing your work. There's a commitment to the unit, which is all a great asset. But they're also going to bring challenges. So first of all, in the military, you don't out yourself for having weaknesses. You don't share any difficulties that you're having. So you don't go to the Disabled Student Services Office to register as an individual with a disability, right? You don't tell your teacher, I'm having a really bad flashback right now. You hold it all within yourself, which makes it very hard for the school to accommodate you. You've also had incredible moral exposure. If you've never heard this term, it's an important one. It means, for example, that you've seen a mother and a child killed on a battlefield. It means that you've had to make terrible life and death decisions about the lives of other people. Kinds of moral questions in lives that most of us will never face. And as a result, you feel alienated from the other students. They seem immature to you. Oh man, she got a B+ on her math exam and she's like falling apart. Well, it's just nothing compared to the issues I've faced in life, right? And so you may be sitting next to the student, but when you're on your phone, you're texting your buddies in your unit to see how they're doing. So how do we address these kinds of issues? Well, I hate to sound partisan here, but it takes a campus, right? You cannot have a stovepipe mentality, because the challenges that veterans bring to you are going to have to be dealt with on a coordinated basis. So I'm hoping you have a wonderful, robust vet center, but I'm hoping that your DSS office and your vet center are in good communication. I'm hoping that your counseling services and your vet center are in good communication. And I'm hoping that your college as a whole is reaching out to the VA or reaching out to the local suicide line. 18 vets take their own lives. I didn't say attempt suicide. Take their own lives every single day. And the United States of America has spent millions of dollars to reduce that figure, and it has had no luck whatsoever. We've killed more of ourselves than have been killed by Iraq and Afghanistan fighters who were fighting against us. This is a really, really serious issue, and it's the kind of issue that takes a whole campus to address. And if you have a robust vet center, then the unit can help those individuals who are in stress. But obviously, you've got to reach out more. You've got to help them get to the services that can help them. And we need teachers who, as a matter of equity, take the fact that some individuals in their class have had this incredible moral exposure, and they need our understanding and our patience and our support. So I come to the end, and I thank you for the time. And I have this quote that Martin Luther King is very famous for, although actually he wasn't the original person to say it. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So I've had a really, really interesting career, a really interesting life, and it ain't over. I've watched us go from segregated schools all the way to accommodating individuals with disabilities. It's been a very, very rewarding experience. We got a lot of work left to do. But I hope that you will share with me the optimism in this statement, and you will commit yourself to helping the bend towards justice continue to grow through giving equity to students of color, to women, to individuals with disabilities, to wounded warriors, so that we can universally raise student success on our campus. Thank you.
All right, Paul. all, I want to thank you very much for sharing your experiences with us. That was wonderful. Thank you.